Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to Humanity Rising on this 11th day of January as we commence the year 2022. It has an auspicious feeling to it, the year 2022. And I think I want to, as we begin our session today, to talk a little bit about not so much the specific issues that we have to deal with, whether it's climate or democracy or even COVID, but rather what feels to me as I've been convening Humanity Rising now for well over 18 months. March will be the second full year of the pandemic, is something that has been very much present. I think as we finished 2021, there was a sense of despair, particularly after the Conference of Parties, the failure of the governments to do anything to really deal with climate change. People were feeling beaten down by lockdowns and social distancing. And I think the year ended with really a sense of what on earth is going on? And how can we do anything about it in a world and in a context where we actually don't understand what's going on? There are too many forces, there's too many conflicts, there's too much paralysis of the human soul. And so for me, as we end 2021, as we really now begin to enter 2022, I think it's up for us to really begin the process of human renewal, how we're going to reclaim our humanity. Human beings have never in the history of the world, that's a big statement, it's a big fact, that never in the history of the world have we been in lockdown globally, simultaneously, and forced into essential isolation. So there's a deep violation going on of what our essential humanity actually means and represents. And we've all been kind of distorted. I mean, just think of we're walking around with masks on and we're keeping 6 feet apart, 1.5 meters, and we're locked down. And many countries around the world are only opening up essential businesses. And yet through that, we need to be fully human. And how we do that within the constraints that are being forced upon us by our governments is a real question that over the next several months, we at Humanity Rising want to develop. What does a full human being mean in a time of COVID? It's just a question that I think is existentially important for us to ask. And whether it's time to break through some of the barriers, particularly in our own mind, after 2 years of institutionalized fear. One of the deep imperatives is how we reach out to one another at this time. Not only with the constraints of the pandemic, but I would say almost the deeper constraint of how social media and politics in our world has created silos and parallel universes, so that whatever it is that we think is true, somehow the social media algorithms reinforce it in a way till finally we think it's not a truth, but the truth. It's so interesting to reflect how social media and what we've been experiencing with COVID almost sort of like in our interior and our exterior, are breaking us down, putting us all in some form of lockdown, some form of silos, some form of reinforcement of subjectivity that somehow becomes our objective truth when enough people agree with us. And yet the social conflict, the social suffering escalates at the same time. In and through this, how we begin to interact and how we begin to dialogue with one another through the current constraints is one of the most important questions in the world. So today, we're going to talk about dialogue. You know, dialogue in a time of COVID, dialogue in a time of social media, at a time when what we really need to do is break out of the strictures that are besetting us and reach out to become more fully human. So that's our theme for today, everyone. I want to thank you for joining. Before I introduce our panelists for our discussion on dialogue, let's just pause as we always do and just take a minute and all the constraints of our world, all the anxieties and concerns. Let us just rest ourselves in our bodies. Let us close our eyes and attune ourselves with our hearts. For the next just minute, 90 seconds or so, listen to your heartbeat in a spirit of thanksgiving and deep gratitude that you're alive. We're all alive at this most extraordinary moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. I was just reflecting as we were in our moment of pause, as I was listening to my heartbeat, that, you know, the research shows that when you're in tune with your heartbeat, you're in tune with the heartbeat of those you love. And while your heart is beating, if you're thinking about someone you love, their heart starts to beat with yours. Isn't that an extraordinary awareness? That even without talking to anyone, if you're attuning to your heart and you're thinking of someone you love, your hearts start to beat together. That's one of the most powerful forms of dialogue that I can think of, is for our hearts to beat as one at this time. The importance of dialogue is something that I've noted, and I'm very delighted now to welcome two people who you'll know well because they've been on Humanity Rising before. Susan Taylor, who's the CEO of Generon International, working with Joe Jaworski and Otto Sharma and various people that have been involved over the years in the U theory and the U practice. All of you know that. One of the most effective tools for personal awareness and social journeying together that has been developed in recent times. And she is very dedicated to how we understand more deeply what dialogue is and really refine it in this time of constraints. She's working with Hidde van der Pol, a Dutchman, currently in Amsterdam, who, like Susan, has been an organizational consultant for many, many years, guiding executives and individuals generally, but also corporations and organizations, and how you understand the pathway to deeper resonance as a team, more abundant creativity, and greater success as an organization by fine-tuning one's capacity to engage in self-awareness and organizational change. Also very dedicated to dialogue. In some ways, 2022, if it's going to be about human empowerment, it has to be about how humans reestablish connection after 2 years of isolation, lockdown, and social distancing. And dialogue, how we understand dialogue, is going to be a critical piece of any kind of human renewal in this coming year. So thank you, everyone. Susan and Hidde, I want to welcome you. And thank you for joining us today. They'll be discussing some aspects of dialogue and a course that they're going to be offering that Humanity Rising wants to support. So I turn the program over to you and we'll circle back when called. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim, and welcome everyone. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen here for just a few moments. And hopefully everyone can see this. So we're really excited, Hidde and I, to be here with all of you with regard to something that we're both very passionate about, and also something that we truly believe has the power, if you will, to do some of the things, Jim, that you just spoke about. And wanted to share a little bit about our purpose, and then after that, why Hidde and I have come together, now in this moment in time. We strongly believe that dialogue is the way to heal humanity and therefore our planet, everything that surrounds us. And we see dialogue as something more than just a conversation. Our teachings come from Dr. David Bohm. Some of you on the call here might be very familiar with him. For those of you who are not, David Bohm was a quantum physicist, American-British quantum physicist. And back in 1984, he attended a group dialogue that was hosted by a gentleman whose name was Patrick Demare. Patrick Demare was the father of group therapy coming out of World War II. And David was very, very interested in looking at the group dynamics that emerged there and linking it with his knowledge around quantum mechanics. And so during the last 10 years of his life, David Bohm investigated and experimented and found ways to bring groups of people together to do some of those things that, again, Jim was just mentioning, like breaking through the barriers that we all put around ourselves as a way to limit, really, what could be possible. And so as Hidde and I, as longtime students of David Bohm, came together over a decade ago, we really found so many similarities between our worldviews and the power we both feel that dialogue has to offer. And so our purpose is really to share everything we've learned and also learn from the groups that we work with regard to what David Bohm originally envisioned. And again, outside of just a conversation, how do we adopt actually a new attitude or a new state of being that is underpinned by what David Bohm discovered and then created through a set of principles? So Hidde and I really come together to try to make an opportunity, create an opportunity where dialogue can become, let's say, more mainstream, where people can understand the deeper parts and components and the essence of dialogue about bringing people together who are very different in their worldviews, not as a way to defend who's right or wrong, not as a way to create a winner and a loser, but instead to create a space where we can hold all of those differences, seeing every other person as legitimate, and birth new realities, create deeper understandings through holding and building harmony, instead of defending and creating divide. So why now? Hidde, maybe you would like to speak to this next slide.
Yeah, thank you, Susan, and thank you, Jim, for hosting us again on this, for us, very essential topic of dialogue. Yeah, why now? Well, I think that there's a lot to be linked to the introduction that Jim just did. Our current context, worldwide context, is a unique context in which we as human beings are being challenged to embrace it, and we're being invited to see how we can co-create a new reality while embracing that new context. So we're challenged. Human beings and humanity as such are being challenged. And if we are not able to embrace it from a different mindset by allowing all different perspectives, experiences, views to be shared, then in our view and in the view based on the definition of dialogue of David Bohm himself, we will not be able to create new realities, to renew and to reclaim humanity, as Jim mentioned in his introduction. So moving from either or thinking towards both and thinking is something that is essential and is a vital part of dialogue. Dialogue itself is more than just a conversation, as Susan pointed out already. And I think that's important to note here again. We're not just talking about the conversation. It is part of it, but it's a much broader view of different opinions, different perspectives coming to life and enriching the potential new outcomes. So with all the challenges that we face, whether it's COVID, climate change, but even closer to home, the discussions, the different points of views that will lead to violence sometimes, to aggressive ways of overruling the other party. All of this is happening more and more. So the divide that Susan mentioned is we're seeing that worldwide more and more because of the different contexts that we're in. So to renew that, to overcome it, to create a new reality, this is the time to approach it from from or through dialogue as such. So that's mainly the reason why now that we faced it. And I wanted to come back to one of the things you mentioned, Jim, about the heartbeats, and I think that was a great component of your introduction, because hearts can beat as one while we still have different views and different opinions. And I think that's the way to go, and that's an essential part of dialogue that we require right now to come up with new solutions and potentials to create and renew humanity as such. Susan, maybe you want to add something there, but that's the reason why we think it's essential right now, and why we should focus on dialogue as a fundament for renewal.
Absolutely. And maybe to build on some of the things that both you and Jim have shared, and I'd love to invite Jim back to have a mini dialogue with us live right now. But linking to the heart connection and the entrainment of the heart that Jim spoke about. You know, David Bohm is considered to be a scientist who was able to prove interconnectedness. And dialogue has a huge component, in my humble opinion, around interconnectedness. And when, Jim, you were talking about the heart and how all of our hearts will sync, I couldn't help but think about the experiment that was done a long time ago with pendulums. And what happened was people put all these different sized pendulums into a room. And what was discovered was that all the smaller pendulums synced up with the largest pendulum in the room. And when I think about the heart being the oscillator in our body and how we can sync up like that because of this interconnected piece that David Bohm was really trying to help us understand through dialogue. It's not lost on me with regard to COVID that in wearing the masks, there are a couple of areas on our body that are highlighted: our eyes and our ears. And when I say that, and I'd love your view on this, Jim, because in a way we've had to separate ourselves. I think you used the word lockdown ourselves from one another, even standing 6 feet apart. What's highlighted on our face are our eyes and our ears. And when I link that to the principles that underpin dialogue, one of which is listening as a foundational principle, right? And then how we see the world through differences. What comes up for both of you? Jim, starting with you, what comes up for both of you when I kind of express how I think the mask is giving us a gift if we choose to accept it?
Well, every crisis is an opportunity in that sense. So I agree with you, and you're right. You know, you start to scrutinize the eyes because that's the only thing that's available for you to see. And I think and there's been some studies and programs on this, that the traditional cues by and through which people have interacted with body language and facial language and the smile and so forth have all been compromised by the masking and the social distancing. So we've had to actually learn new pathways to understand the body language. If you've only got the eyes, then you've got a very limited, but very important. The eyes are the gateway to the soul, as they say, goes directly to your brain. So I agree with what you're saying, and it's been a challenge to, even on Zoom, you know, how do you develop intimacy virtually? It's different than intimacy when you're physically proximate. But we humans have been amazingly adaptive in figuring that out. So I think you're making a very good point. Intimacy by other means is what we're having to learn, and dialogue by other means, and contact by other means.
Yeah, and if I may add on that, because it's it's probably going further than just observing with the eyes. And when you mentioned the theory U in your introduction, I think it's also about sensing. And sensing is really a way of feeling and connecting other than with our regular senses that we are used to. And I think it's a good example on how we can reinvent ourselves given the new context that initially kind of make us feel limited, but then can be also an invitation to open up different ways, like observing and like sensing, to create new realities for ourselves. And that's what I think is what I mentioned with the why now. It's really trying to invite every one of us as a human being to embrace our context and see through the initial limitations to create new realities and see it as an invitation for new possibilities.
I love that, Hidde. And just reading some of the amazing comments in the chat. Interestingly, some people can see a gift in wearing a mask and what it could symbolize for us, the gift in what it symbolizes, and others are like, no way. And this is the beautiful thing. There's opposite views, even on this chat in this moment. How wonderful, and to be able to hold that as a way to try to reframe things, to potentially see the other instead of defending mask or no mask, which leads me to a bit deeper mention I'd like to share with regard to why now. And Hidde, you were talking about a world where we need both and, not either or, because the divides, whether it's masks or whether it's our administration in the US or climate change, right? There's a lot of divide globally right now. And when I link this back to David Bohm and in my own way, me coining him as, if you will, the father of interconnectedness, I'm struck, and it's interesting to me that when you spell the word "and" backwards, what do you get? DNA. And so for me, that links to this deeper interconnected piece that I think we're all here to explore, and something I think we really need to open our hearts and minds to as a way to reclaim our humanity and as a way to have human renewal in our world. So what bubbles up around the "and"?
Yeah, thank you for that, Susan. I like that very much. And I think what bubbles up for me when I heard you say seeing the other, it kind of helps us to build and start seeing the whole. And I read words like unity in the chat, and I think unity is wholeness, is connectedness with each other. And if we are just seeing our own perspective, if we are so stubbornly fixated on our own perspective, our own experience, we will only be and stay a fragment. And through fragments, we will stay fragmented and we will never see the whole. And in order to create new realities for humanity as a whole, we need to be open to other perspectives in order to get a connection to that whole, whatever the perspective or the opinions or the views, the point of views are of other people. So it's not to judge it, it's to invite it and to walk around it and to embrace it, because that's the gateway to wholeness, which is the gateway in itself to new realities.
Yeah, I would add to what you're saying, Hidde, and with the following comment. You know, I think you're really asking a profound question, Susan. And I was thinking of of in Star Wars, when Luke Skywalker was learning about the Force. What did Obi-Wan Kenobi do? He put a mask on Luke so that Luke couldn't see. And he made the point to Luke that the way for Luke to connect with the Force was not to use his eyes, but to use his sensing. So if you think about that, with lockdown and social distancing and masks and so forth, we've been put in constraints that have disrupted our ordinary reality and our ordinary way of perceiving the world. And the opportunity is to use that as an incredible opportunity to learn sensing by other means, which will put us in touch with the Force. Let's just use that word for a moment, in ways that we probably would have never discovered had we not been forced into a disconnected world, a constrained world, given the conditions of COVID-19, et cetera. So how we utilize the deprivation as an asset, I think you're raising a very important point. And I think that leads very naturally into an accentuation on dialogue in this particular time. So I wanted to bring that perspective in.
Perspective. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. So when I link sensing to dialogue and what we've been sharing up until this moment, the word that's coming up for me right now is surrender. Surrender. And for me, just to share my own definition of what I believe surrender to be, it's the intersection of change and acceptance. What could happen at the intersection of change and acceptance? And I believe that's what the U process that you referred to in your early remarks, Jim, can represent for us here, linked to dialogue, where we can be in a situation where we have two diametrically opposed views. And in that moment, what do I choose? And I saw this in the chat, which is triggering this thought. What if I were to accept these differences that you just described? Not agree with them per se, not condone them. What if I were just to accept them as what is? Being in that place of surrender where I choose not to resist or suffer, A, because it just doesn't feel very good, and B, we don't have to suffer when we can just have a willingness to accept what is in the moment when we're being present. Now, I'm not trying to say that these things don't affect us emotionally, psychologically, physically, intellectually, in every single way. What we've been through for the last 2 years absolutely does, right? So much so that there's kind of word on the street about this idea that we all have a little bit of PTSD going on right now. We've been through trauma. We've been through trauma. But what happens when we can take something like trauma or take something that might not be news I want to hear, and instead just surrender into it and sense what could be a possibility that could come out of, let's say, this trauma or this experience that tends to be more negative. And I think dialogue helps us to see things wholly from all angles. And in that, it creates a tension, a creative tension, that then can birth a new understanding or a new idea. At least that's been my experience thus far. Any experiences you all want to share about that idea?
Yeah, so what comes up for me while I was listening to you, Susan, was the question, what makes us fixate on our own point of view only? And I came up with two things: fears and discomfort. And usually, which is also from my own experience, it is an awareness that is needed to be activated in the moment to become aware of fears or potential fears that are actually keeping me from staying open to other points of views and perspectives. It is becoming conscious of the fact that fears are there, they are in play, and also there it goes, and that's more the individual embracing of your own inner context. It's embracing those fears, invite them also on the table in order to create that openness for other points of views and start breaking down the fixation on your own perspective only. So that's what came up for me, Susan.
What was coming up for me is a contradiction, Susan, that I'd like to bring in to the conversation, and love to have both of your comments. You know, dialogue by definition is a interaction between people on kind of an even playing field where there's a possibility for talking back and forth. But what's happening under COVID is that our governments and social media giants are extinguishing even the possibility of dialogue, because people that are questioning the prevailing storyline about COVID and are even offering alternative therapies for COVID are being shut down and shut out, so that there's even the possibility of dialogue has gone away. And so I think, you know, while we talk about dialogue, we also need to really think through, how do you even begin dialogue when dialogue is no longer possible? And that's pretty close to happening right now around COVID. Anybody that's challenging the official narrative is shut out on Facebook, on Instagram, on Google, and there's a apparatus in place to look for anyone who even wants to engage in dialogue. So I think when we're talking about dialogue, it's important to honor it as an abstraction, but also to bring it into the kind of the nitty-gritty, the granularity of the constraints that are increasingly being placed in our world around dialogue. And it's happening, as I mentioned in my introduction, just in social media. The social media doesn't put you in touch with someone with an opposing point of view, with an invitation to dialogue. Social media accentuates your own extremism. And in fact, there's many studies about the fact that the Facebooks of the world are turning ordinary people into extremists, because they're reinforcing a worldview and then giving them more and more information that leads them further and further from any objective reality into some kind of a cul-de-sac of belief that is socially dysfunctional. So I would love, you know, both of you to think, to consider these challenges to dialogue, and I'd be very interested in what you have to say.
And there was darkness. I hope that they'll put on the light again in a little while. Yeah, just what comes up for me, Jim, is the importance of dialogue, as you mentioned it, that should be stimulated by all these different platforms is one side of it. Even here in the Netherlands, and I blogged about it a couple of weeks ago, when you look at the talk shows and the people who are invited, it's just one opinion-based people sitting at the table.
Exactly.
So even there, it is food for fragmentation, because they're only allowing one point of view, which is a challenge. The other part of it, I think I wrote down here, is there you go, is autonomy and discernment, which comes from probably the inner dialogue of each individual. So whatever is being presented to you, we need to become and activate our self-awareness to allow ourselves to create the discernment around whatever is being fueled to us, and being able to trust our inner dialogue, that we ourselves as an individual are the ones that can steer that. There's nobody else that can keep us from information that is inside ourselves, our inner information. So I think it's a vital element of dialogue as well. It's that active self-awareness in the moment. And a piece of that is the discernment about and the critical view on what is being presented through social media, through talk shows, or whatever is one-sided information coming to us.
That's similar to what was coming up for me. I wrote down, we need to choose more consciously how we participate together. I think we have, in a way, developed a society that feeds on and fuels our fears. I think media companies know this. Look at the headlines. Look at the headlines. And when I think about that, I can't help but be brought to a project, actually, that I was so grateful to work on. And the project was about malnutrition in India for children. And for those of you who know the different cultures that might be involved there, I just want to share that dialogue was the underpinning practice that we used to bring a multi-sector group together that included business people, predominantly male. It included government officials. It included NGOs, and it included, as part of that, the women of the children who were suffering. And so to have those women in the room, those mothers, with the other predominantly male groups I just shared about, was actually stunning. And how could that even happen? By being open enough to at least step through the door and to consciously choose to participate, even though it wasn't the norm, even though it was something that was causing huge divide. And it was just amazing what happened there when you could get that type of a group together to just authentically share. Of course, giving them some tools and practices that they could use to have the courage to actually show up in the room every day. So I just keep getting back to this idea of, look, we all have confirmation bias, we all have fears. We can all get sucked into these different things like you were describing, Jim, myself included. And when I finally become aware enough to notice that I'm getting sucked in, that's my choice moment. And then I can choose something differently. With the most simple things in our lives building to the more complex, I don't know, maybe I'm an idealist, but I think it could help a lot.
You know, Roderick Bedingfield has put something very beautiful in the chat that I think is worth reading. It's a quote from David Bohm. In the dialogue, according to Bohm, we are not going to decide what to do about anything. This is crucial. Otherwise, we are not free. We must have an empty space where we are not obliged to do anything, nor to come to any conclusions, nor to say anything or not say anything. It's open and free. It's an empty space. The word leisure has that meaning of a kind of empty space. Occupied is the opposite of leisure. It's full. So we have here a kind of empty space where anything may come in. And after we finish, we just empty it. We are not trying to accumulate anything. That is one of the points about dialogue. As Krishnamurti used to say, the cup has to be empty to hold something. That's a beautiful, beautiful quote by David Bohm. Thank you so much, Roderick. And Susan Hidde would love to have your comments on this, because I think it's a continuation of what you were just saying, Susan.
I'm so grateful that Roderick, you posted that, and Jim, that you shared it with all of us. The immediate thing that comes to mind is the phases that we go through as communities. This is based on the work of Scott Peck, right? And so when we come together in groups, typically, whether it's a small team or larger group that we label as community, we all come in what's called pseudo community, right? So we're kind of polite. We don't show our full selves. We're coming together for the first time, and it's innate within us. We want to be liked. And so we show up in a way that we think is going to create that opportunity for us. And it isn't until then you go through the chaos, as Scott Peck would describe it, to where you can really get to that space of emptying. And he used the word emptying. So it's almost like you come together and you have to kind of get messy, right? And in dialogue, those are the different views that I think that come out in a room. And as you're continuing to try to hold those, creating an opportunity for that tension to kind of emerge, or the chaos, as Peck would call it, it's only until you start to open yourself enough to not defend yourself to where you can then begin to empty. And once you can begin to empty, then you can come into these truer communities, what Scott Peck called authentic community. So I bring that up because that's the first thing that came up, at least for me. And when I think about that and link it to surrender, and I link it to what we were talking about earlier around sensing, yeah, I think we do have to find ways to empty ourselves of the things that we hold that no longer are in service to us, and therefore no longer in service to other. So that's what's coming up in the moment anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Hidde.
Yeah, when I build on this, I think, thank you for sharing that, Roderick. I really believe this is linked to not wanting to solve the problem, but to trust in the emergence of that new desired future, or the solution that will emerge. And when I hear you say the word surrender again, Susan, you could also say surrender to the emergence of that new future, or the new reality. That's one thing. The second thing came to me when you mentioned the word chaos. If we really zoom out and look at the planet Earth right now and see how we are confronted with chaos, I feel that we are in the midst of emptying our cup, and it will last for a little while. So chaos will surround us until our cup of the humanity cup is actually empty, for us to then trust in the emergence and the filling up the cup with a new reality.
Love that perspective. Those of you who know me, you'll hear me say this a lot. I just fully believe that tension is the point of creation. And when I think about it that way, how a baby is born, or a star is born, or when you plant the seed that has to sprout and push itself up through the ground to then become the mighty oak. And so I love this idea that what if we could accept that we're in this tension, and yet the tension that we're feeling, although it might not feel pleasant all the time, is an opportunity to do what you're saying, Hidde, is actually a good sign. if I heard you correctly, right? That we're in it now, and so we are emptying that cup. I love that perspective. That's fabulous.
Well, there's no doubt that there's a great emptying being done, Hidde, if you're correct, because we're having probably more chaos at more levels than at any time in history. So let us hope it's emptying our cup. And into that cup, then through dialogue, something very beautiful can emerge. This was what reminding me is of the Zen notion, sort of spaciousness, of emptiness. In the Chinese paintings, where it's nature that is dominant, and the people are just these little figures in a corner somewhere against the vastness of the Tao. So I think that comes into this Bohmian notion of dialogue for me, that one enters true dialogue only from the point of view of emptiness. So that, as you were pointing out, Hidde, earlier, there's an internal dialogue that has to take place before an interpersonal dialogue can take place. Because if you don't come in empty, then you don't have the room to hear or to sense. So in some ways, at that level of Krishnamurti and David Bohm, dialogue is a spiritual exercise. And only when it's understood as a deeply spiritual exercise that it accomplishes its purpose and its work.
Yeah, that's great to mention here as well. And I think being true to the elements of dialogue the way David Bohm envisioned it, we should allow people to discover that they are not empty within the dialogue. So we should be open to people to enter into the dialogue, probably not conscious of the fact that they are not empty at that point, but they will discover it through the dialogue. And that's including everybody in the dialogue. Because if we would set a prerequisite in saying you have to be empty before we can have this dialogue, then we would not apply the principles of dialogue the way David Bohm envisioned it. So it's really an inner awareness through dialogue, and that's where the chaos comes in, because it's that fire that we need. We need people to become conscious of the fact that they are fixated on just their own perspective, and they will be confronted with that through that fire in the dialogue. So it's an all-inclusive piece of dialogue through which every individual or any party will discover where they are at, and they will see and become more conscious of where they are in their dialogue and how they approached it and how they entered into the dialogue.
Yeah, and I think David Bohm provided for that, Hidde. It's a really great insight. I would say, at least in my experience, and most of my work has been done, in the business arena, that most of the people that come into a workshop or a dialogue conversation are not coming in empty. Quite the contrary. When I think about business and how we're on this hamster wheel and things have become, much more automatic, and the busyness is very much there for us, as opposed to, taking pause and making silence our friend, and some of the principles that David Bohm underscores as it links to emptying the vessel, so to speak. And I really resonate with the spiritual components that you bring up, Jim, because I do believe that when David Bohm developed this principle about suspending your opinion, that's really what's creating a space for us to empty. He didn't mean suspend from the perspective of set aside or ignore or put away for the moment. He meant suspending, and he said this, he said, suspend it right in front of you, like it's hanging from the ceiling in front of your nose, for yourself and for everyone else to see. And linked to what you were saying, Hidde, that's where we get that creative tension. And that's where we're emptying by giving our opinions and sharing them, and internally and externally understanding my assumptions my points of view, my mindsets to the best of my ability, and at the same time, creating a space for the rest of the people in the group to also chime in about what they're experiencing, right? And until we can get to a point, that automatically builds trust. When you can get to that point where you can, again, hear, receive, give, share feedback, even on how you are perceiving me in this moment, especially if I have a very different opinion than you, it creates that space, and through that emptying creates the conditions, I think, for the new realities that David Bohm would talk about. Because linking to the heart sync, it's then when we get through that chaos and we start to actually be in that emptying phase, so to speak, that we entrain, and that we become what David Bohm called a single intelligence, because all the hearts are connected at that point. The barriers have been lessened, if not dropped. And we create that space where we realize, first and foremost, before we have any titles or jobs or roles or descriptions, we're human, and that we're actually more alike than different. And that's really, I think, when you see those sorts of things emerging, that's kind of when you know, so to speak, that you've hit dialogue. And I want to be careful when I say that, and this is the last sentence, I promise. I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but one of David Bohm's biggest frustrations was that people were not doing the inner work outside of the dialogue circle. So they'd come for the dialogue workshop and they'd remember their principles. They would listen maybe more empathetically. They would embrace silence, all the things that David Bohm talked about with regard to dialogue. And then when the session was over, they'd go about their daily business and they weren't practicing. And so really, if we are going to come to a space where we are at least open to emptying, we've got to be doing the work outside the circle. That's my plug.
Well, I think you're making a very important point, and David Bohm was too. You know that there's intense preparation required, internal preparation before a true dialogue can begin. And you know what was coming up for me, Susan, while you were talking, is this notion of dialogue really embracing the other as beloved, not as enemy. You know, because in dialogue, there's a thesis and antithesis. And in order for a true synthesis to emerge, you really have to embrace the other with a trust and a empathy that creates or is experienced as part of a container of love. You know, and it's worth just noting, you know, the first person to ever use God or the infinite as the beloved was a woman in Persia in the 9th century called Rabia. She was the first one to understand this principle of true communion between two poles, that you need to embrace the other pole, she said, as the beloved. And when you do that, everything is possible. If you don't do that, everything will be limited to the degree to which you haven't been able to embrace fully the other person and love them as you love yourself. So I think that's another aspect of beloved, of dialogue as a spiritual exercise, which we're really contemplating today, I think.
Yeah, I like that a lot, and that's, for me, that leads to the shared meaning, which is also an element of dialogue as well. You will only come to that point, or you will experience shared meaning when you embrace the other as your beloved as well.
Yeah. Yeah. This is a tall order, guys, that you're putting before us if we're going to truly dialogue. It's a full commitment. It's an existential commitment of being. It's not just a conversation. if I understand you correctly.
Absolutely. And linking to the shared meaning piece, just imagine for one moment if we could put aside our differences just to embrace each other as fellow human beings, knowing that there is something common about every single one of us. That's what David Bohm did. He called shared meaning the glue that holds groups together. And in other writings, he called it the cement. That's how strongly he believed that this idea of coming to an intersection of meaning with fellow human beings could be so powerful that David Bohm actually, in an interview, shared that he really felt that this practice of dialogue could solve world peace. So that's our goal. Our goal is to bring it into the world to the best of our ability in the way that we believe David Bohm envisioned it, learning from everyone as we go, right? So I think this could be a good opportunity maybe to share a little bit, Hidde, about the course we're undertaking. And if you don't mind, maybe I'll go ahead and share that slide. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. While I'm back into the darkness. Yes, so based on our belief that we've shared with you in the past hour or so, we have come up with something to support our purpose of making dialogue more mainstream. And it's an online course that we've developed on the principles of dialogue itself. And what you see in front of you now is the 6 steps, if you like, to undergo this whole process of dialogue during the course. So obviously there's a chance, if you're interested in all of this and experiencing all the elements of dialogue, it starts with registration. And maybe you could share in the chat, Susan, already one of the links that give you the opportunity to register. The course will take place with the start of February throughout March and April, so 3 months. What you will receive after registration is the orientation package, and in that is a detailed preparation, if you like, that we will send you through email to get you up and running and ready for the course. Then with that, there are indications of all the dates that we selected throughout the 3 months. And we invite you to put those in your calendar. We will come back to the actual dates, but important to mark here is that given our busy schedules and our experience with busy schedules, is that we took into consideration all of that. So with a minimum amount of time invested, you will get a maximum output out of this course. So we've created basically 2 moments: a moment at the beginning of each month throughout the course, and a moment at the end of each month. And then in between, and that's the step number 3, there is a possibility for you as a participant to have one-on-one coaching with either Susan or myself. Next to that, you'll have a touch base moments with your co-pilot. So we have kind of a buddy system embedded in the course as well. And then next to that, there's a support system that you can reach out to Susan and myself at any given moment. And so all of this is to maximize the experience throughout the whole course and make your participation as rich as it can be. So that's kind of the roadmap of how we've set it up. And as I said in the beginning, it's really the experience of dialogue within the course that is about dialogue as well. So that's the setup that we've come up with.
Thanks, Hidde. And I think as part of that, I'm going to go ahead and show the course details. And while I'm pulling that up, maybe share a little bit about how at the beginning of the month, we have set that up as an opportunity to learn from each other in kind of a more interactive tutorial style. The session at the end of the month will actually be focused on real life, in the moment, opportunities that are there for the participants as a whole through different themes that we will be able to pull from the tutorial and also the coaching, and also business cases, really, where we can all use these practices and principles of dialogue to navigate and help some of our colleagues in the course create different understandings about what they might be going through. In addition to that, we are going to be having a lot of different guests throughout these multiple courses over time that we're offering. And so for those of you who know my business partner, Joseph Jaworski, he will be kicking things off with us on the first course in February, the first course date in February. And then he'll also be part of one of the interactive sessions where we're dealing with, let's say, a real life opportunity challenge issue. And so this next slide simply shows you the dates that have been selected along with the times. I think the link to apply is in the chat should you have interest. And just to go over it at the highest level, there's 3 sessions of 2 hours each that will happen at the beginning of the month. Those are the interactive tutorials. The private one-on-one coaching happens throughout the month at the participants' convenience, privately one-on-one with Hidde and or me or both. You can alternate, it's your choice. And then the latter part of the month, we will have the real-time application session, the interactive opportunities to go ahead and really deal with any sort of challenges that might be facing you, where you want to try to apply some of what you learn in the course and get some peer-to-peer coaching. So Hidde, this is the last slide. Maybe you want to take us through that and then we can summarize everything and wrap it up.
Yep. So multiple times now I've seen the link in the chat. So if you are interested, please copy that one and or register right away. The hospitality of Humanity Rising has been amazing for us to be able to get our purpose into manifestation, if you like. So for that, we would like to offer a special price. An original price was $14.97, and we've decided to offer all of those who will register between now and January 15, 2022, with a price off. So the actual price for those who are registering based on this panel, it's going to be $1,250. And then in the registration, it will be pointed out by itself, but it's very important to have your the reasons why and your motivation to actually commit to this course on dialogue.
Thank you, Hidde. And I think just to add, if I may, I get the sense that a lot of the people who are with us today know quite a bit about dialogue. So how awesome is that? Again, we get to all learn from each other. And I think there are some things that Hidde and I will be offering in the course that maybe are not as well known, let's say, with regard to David Bohm and others who influenced him. We're going to go all the way back to Socrates, for example, when we start talking about the history of dialogue and how it came to be through the sensing and the worldview of David Bohm. We have people who will be joining us who have had interactions with Dr. Bohm, experiences meeting him, and able to share some of those things that maybe aren't written about or in the books, right? So I think this is an awesome opportunity for people who are really interested in what we were discussing today with Jim, and yeah, just really appreciate the opportunity to share about it.
Yeah, and just to build on this for a last sentence, Susan, I think David Bohm would have wanted for us to evolve his view on dialogue and his vision on dialogue, moving forward into the emerging future as well. So it's a continuous working on dialogue and expanding the elements through the experience of going through it.
Well, thank you, Susan. Thank you, Hidde. This has been a marvelous presentation. And Cuff Ferguson has put something in the chat that I think is worth bringing in as we close. He says there's an interesting perspective about COVID here. It is thought of as a dis-ease, yet it has led to a space for creative dialogue about who we truly are as souls on the planet and what we want to create as human beings and how we want to become new human beings. And I think that's an aspect that is worth underscoring, the paradox of dialogue, the paradox of the thesis and the antithesis. They can be in conflict, they can be in love, they can synthesize, they can go to war. All things are possible as 2 points or more points of intelligence and capacity come together. And how we choose to respond is what really makes the difference. In some ways, COVID is a Rorschach test. What do we actually see in it? Well, what we see in it is what we're going to get out of it. And I thank you, Cuff, for that observation that paradoxically, at a time of maximum constraint, we're being allowed to see and hear in new ways. And so I commend Susan and Hidde's course for any of you who would be interested in joining. And I thank you both. We'll have you back again on Humanity Rising soon to tell us about it. Maybe you can report back at the end of the course and tell us how it went. And you're so right. It's not a modern phenomenon. It goes all the way back to deep antiquity, to Socrates and the dialogues of Plato, who one of the greatest philosophers, who said that ultimately all philosophy, he said, should be in dialogue. So thank you both. That will conclude our Humanity Rising session for today. Everyone, you're all welcome to join the after chat session. Susan, Hidde, you're welcome to join a more informal interaction. And then we'll see everyone again tomorrow. But as we close, Susan, I'm going to ask you just to give us out of your heart, just final thought or just a blessing that we can take with us for our day.
You from the heart. I've been sitting here thinking as you've been making your closing remarks. When I think about destiny and when I think about what we want to create with regard to humanity, for me, the only destiny is what you are willing to become. That's my parting thought.
Your only destiny is what you're willing to become. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Hidde. Thank you, Susan.